Welcome to Too Fond of Books. I'm Janelle, and this is another March Mystery Madness video. In today's video, I wanted to do just a bit of a discussion. I wanted to compare two different books, two different types of subgenres in the mystery category. And so we're going to delve into that in a minute. But first, here is the answer to yesterday's My March Mystery Madness Mindbender. The clue was, this series of police procedurals features a detective who ignores procedure and loves crossword puzzles and opera. And the answer is Inspector Morse from the Colin Dexter series. I love Inspector Morse. I love this series. They're set in Oxford, and Inspector Morse works for the police department there. And he's a great character. He's a good cop, but he really is not very interested in the procedures of being a police officer, administration, all that kind of stuff. He wants to solve puzzles, essentially. And he's got a great long-suffering sidekick in Sergeant Louise. So yeah, check out the Inspector Morse series by Colin Dexter. And stay tuned to the end of the video for the next My March Mystery Madness Mindbender. So let's compare. I thought it might be interesting to compare Scandinavian noir or Nordic noir with the whodunit. So these are two kind of subgenres in the mystery, in the overarching umbrella that is mystery fiction. So what is Scandinavian noir? It's crime fiction usually written from the police point of view and set in a Nordic country. Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, or Sweden. And I liked this definition off of Wikipedia. Plain language, avoiding metaphor, and set in a bleak landscape. It results in a dark and morally complex mood depicting a tension between the apparently still and bland social surface and the murder, misogyny, rape, and racism it depicts as lying underneath. So Scandinavian noir is a very definite type of book. People who like Scandinavian noir have a very detailed expectation when it comes to these books. They expect a certain type of a story. They expect brutal crimes and shocking violence. They expect a plot that is strong with multiple threads, complex, and maybe a few twists. They want a protagonist who is brooding and introspective, troubled, but with a fierce sense of justice. The setting is desolate and harsh. It could be a city, it could be in the country, urban or rural, that doesn't really seem to matter. And a prose style that is Spartan and direct. Henning Mankell has been called the father of Nordic noir. So I chose his book, Faceless Killers, for this comparison discussion. This is the first in the Kurt Wallander series. So we're going to get into some of the detail in Faceless Killers and compare this Scandinavian noir to a whodunit. Now, whodunits are complex, plot-driven types of detective stories. The puzzle is the main focus. So setting, there's not huge descriptions of setting because that doesn't matter very much. Although whodunits, again, they could be in cities, or they could be in the country. They could be urban or rural. Although a country house is a very popular setting for a whodunit, what matters here is who is the killer. And again, people who read whodunits have a very strong expectation of what they will find in that book. They want a fair play mystery. They want a puzzle mystery. They want the clues laid out so that they could conceivably solve the mystery before the killer is revealed at the end. And so the book that I chose to compare to Faceless Killers is Still Life by Louise Penny. Now, interestingly, this is not strictly a whodunit, but it is enough of a whodunit that I felt comfortable using it as the book to compare with. Her Armand Gamache series are set in Quebec, and they are definitely whodunits. There is a murder, there are clues laid out, and you can conceivably, as the reader, solve the mystery before it is solved for you at the end of the book. But Louise Penny's books have other elements of other genres as well. A lot of people describe them as cozies, and I can see that. Many of her books are set in a village called Three Pines, and so that village setting is very much a cozy type of mystery for people. There are definitely cozy elements, but it is not strictly a cozy either. It's also a police procedural because the protagonist is a detective in the police force. He has a team and they get called out to solve a crime. So it's also a police procedural. Louise Penny's books are character driven, definitely, and there is a lot about human nature and the flaws of human nature in her stories. But you could easily call it crime fiction. There is definitely a crime in these books. Faceless Killers, I would also call crime fiction. So let's get into a comparison. Here we go. A comparison of Faceless Killers, which is Scandinavian Noir, with Still Life, which is a whodunit. Let's say it's a whodunit for the purposes of this comparison. So I'm going to talk about 4 different pieces. We're going to compare 4 different parts of these 2 books. We're going to compare plot, and in that will include the type of crime that is in the story. We're going to compare the protagonists, the setting, and the prose style. So let's start with setting. Three Pines is a village in Quebec, and that is the setting for Still Life, the first in the Armand Gamache series. And I will just read you a description of the setting right from the book. Why not? Three Pines wasn't on any tourist map, being too far off any main or even secondary road. Like Narnia, it was generally found unexpectedly and with a degree of surprise that such an elderly village should have been hiding in this valley all along. Anyone's fortunate enough to find it once usually found their way back. And Thanksgiving in early October was the perfect time. The weather was usually crisp and clear. The summer scents of old garden roses and phlox were replaced by musky autumn leaves, wood smoke, and roast turkey. And then another description of the village a little bit later. 3 huge pines faced him at the far end of the green. Between him and them was a pond, a bunch of sweater-clad children circling it, hunting for frogs, he supposed. The village green sat, not surprisingly, in the center of the village, a road called the Commons circling it with homes, except behind him, which seemed to be the commercial district. It was a very short commercial. It consisted, as far as Gamache could see, of a dépanneur whose Pepsi sign read Bellevue, I think, I don't know. Beside that was a boulangère, a bistro, and a bookstore. 4 roads led off the commons like the spokes of a wheel or the directions of a compass. So the setting of Still Life is a small, cozy village outside of Quebec. The setting of Faceless Killers is also a village outside the city, although it is even outside of that village a remote farmhouse. But the village is described as, in the village of Lunarp, just north of Cade Lake, on the way to beautiful Cragholm Lake, right in the heart of Skane. Nothing ever happens here. Time stands still in this village where life flows along like a creek without vigor or intent. The only people who live here are a few old farmers who have sold or leased out their lands to someone else. We live here and wait for the inevitable. So both of these are set in a village. And so there are some similarities between the settings of these two books. They're both northern climates, small village with a city police officer and team coming into the village to investigate. But in Still Life, the book stays in that village. It is insular, it is close, it is cozy and confined. In The Faceless Killers, the setting expands beyond that initial village, that initial remote farmhouse. It is bleak and open, and it reflects the broader political implications that happen in the story. So what is the plot? What is the crime in these two books? In Still Life, 76-year-old Miss Jane Neal is found with an arrow wound in her heart in the woods. It is October in the village of Three Pines. This book does have a complex plot with multiple threads. There are a lot of secrets, there is long-standing hatred, there is fear, and there are multiple murders. I'm going to read you the opening pages of this, which set the story, set the setting. I mean, it describes, there's a bit of the setting, and you meet the victim, and you also meet the inspector. Miss Jane Neal met her maker in the early morning mist of Thanksgiving Sunday. It was pretty much a surprise all around. Miss Neal's was not a natural death, unless you're of the belief everything happens as it's supposed to. If so, for her 76 years, Jane Neal had been walking toward this final moment when death met her in the brilliant maple woods on the verge of the village of Three Pines. She'd fallen, spread-eagled, as though making angels in the bright and brittle leaves. Chief Inspector Armand Gamache of the Sûreté de Quebec knelt down, his knees cracking like the report of a hunter's rifle, his large, expressive hands hovering over the tiny circle of blood marring her fluffy cardigan, as though like a magician he could remove the wound and restore the woman. But he could not. That was his gift. But he could not. That wasn't his gift. Fortunately for Gamache, he had others. The scent of mothballs, his mother's perfume, met him halfway. Jane's gentle and kindly eyes stared as though surprised to see him. He was surprised to see her. That was his little secret. Not that he'd ever seen her before. No. His little secret was that in his mid-50s, at the height of a long and now apparently stalled career, violent death still surprised him. Which was odd for the head of homicide, and perhaps one of the reasons he hadn't progressed further in the cynical world of the Sûreté. Gamache always hoped maybe someone had gotten it wrong and there was no dead body. But there was no mistaking the increasingly rigid Miss Neal. Straightening up with the help of Inspector Beauvoir, he buttoned his lined Burberry against the October chill and wondered. Faceless Killers. The victim is elderly farmer Johan Lundgren, who is found bludgeoned to death in his farmhouse. His wife, Maria Lundgren, is left to die with a noose around her neck. It is January in the village of Lennarp in a remote farmhouse. So here's some from the opening pages of Faceless Killers. He has forgotten something. He knows that for sure when he wakes up. Something he dreamt during the night. Something he ought to remember. He tries to remember, but sleep is like a black hole, a well that reveals nothing of its contents. At least I didn't dream about the bulls, he thinks. Then I would have been hot and sweaty, as if I had suffered through a fever during the night. This time the bulls left me in peace. He lies still in the darkness and listens. His wife's breathing at his side is so faint that he can scarcely hear it. One of these mornings she'll be lying dead beside me and I won't even notice, he thinks. Or maybe it'll be me. Daybreak will reveal that one of us has been left all alone. He checks the clock on the table next to the bed. The hands glow and register 4:45 a.m. Why did I wake up, he asks himself. Usually I sleep till 5:30. I've done that for more than 40 years. Why did I wake now? He listens to the darkness, and suddenly he is wide awake. Something is different. Something has changed. He stretches out one hand tentatively until he touches his wife's face. With his fingertips, he can feel that she's warm. So she's not dead. Neither of them has been left alone yet. He listens intently to the darkness. The horse, he thinks. She's not neighing. That's why I woke up. Normally the mare whinnies at night. I hear it without waking up, and in my subconscious I know that I can keep on sleeping. Carefully he gets up from the creaky bed. For 40 years they've owned it. It was the only piece of furniture they bought when they got married. It's also the only bed they'll ever have. He can feel his left knee aching as he crosses the wooden floor to the window. I'm old, he thinks, old and worn out. Every morning when I wake up, I'm surprised all over again that I'm 70 years old. He looks out into the winter night. It's 7th January, 1990, and no snow has fallen in Scone this winter. The lamp outside the kitchen door casts its glow across the yard, the bare chestnut tree, and the fields beyond. He squints toward the neighboring farm where the Lovegrens live. The long, low, white house is dark. The stable in the corner against the farmhouse has a pale yellow lamp above its black door. That's where the mare stands in her stall, and that's where she whinnies uneasily at night when something disturbs her. He listens to the darkness. The bed creaks behind him. What are you doing? Mutters his wife. Go back to sleep, he replies. I'm just stretching my legs. Is your knee hurting again? No. Then come back to bed. Don't stand there freezing. You'll catch cold. He hears her turn over onto her side. Once we loved each other, he thinks, but he shields himself from his own thought. That's too noble a word, love. It's not for the likes of us. Someone who has been a farmer for more than 40 years, who has worked every day bowed over the heavy Scandinavian clay, does not use the word love when he talks about his wife. In our lives, love has always been something totally different. He looks at the neighbor's house, peering, trying to penetrate the darkness of the winter night. Winnie, he thinks. Winnie in your stall so I know that everything's all right, so I can lie down under the quilt for a little while longer. A retired, crippled farmer's day is long and dreary enough as it is. He realizes that he's looking at the kitchen window of the neighbor's house. All these years he has cast an occasional glance at his neighbor's window. Now something looks different. Or is it just the darkness that confuses him? He blinks and counts to 20 to rest his eyes. Then he looks at the window again, and now he's sure that it's open. A window that has always been closed at night is open, and the mare hasn't whinnied at all. The mare hasn't whinnied because Lovegren hasn't taken his usual nightly walk to the stable when his prostate acts up and drives him out of bed. And then a little further along, he has gone over to his neighbor's house. Then he hears the cry. It's weak, more like a moan. It's Mariah. He goes over to the bedroom window and peeks cautiously through the gap between the curtain and the window frame. Suddenly he knows that Johan is dead. He shines his torch inside and blinks hard before he forces himself to look. Mariah is crumpled up on the floor, tied to a chair. Her face is bloody. Her false teeth lie broken on her spattered nightgown. All he can see of Johan is a foot. The rest of his body is hidden by the curtain. He limps back and climbs over the fence again. His knee aches as he stumbles desperately across the frozen clay. First he calls the police. Then he takes a crowbar from a closet that smells of mothballs. Wait here, Hannah. You don't need to see this. What happened? She asks with tears of fright in her eyes. I don't know, he says, but I woke up when the mare wasn't neighing in the night. I know that for sure. It was 7th January, 1990. Not yet dawn. And then the next page, when Wallander gets the call about the body. Wallander dressed quickly without showering, poured himself a cup of the lukewarm coffee that was still in the thermos, and looked out the window. He lived on Maria Gatan in central Stadt, and the facade of the building across from him was cracked and gray. He wondered fleetingly whether there would be any snow in Scone this winter. He hoped not. Scandinavian snowstorms always brought periods of uninterrupted drudgery. Car wrecks, snowbound women going into labor, isolated old people, and downed power lines. With the snowstorms came chaos, and he felt ill-equipped to deal with chaos this winter. Anxiety at his wife's departure still burned inside of him. And then at the bottom of the page, the squad car was waiting for him at the side road toward Cade Lake. Peters had climbed out and was watching a hare bounding back and forth out in a field. When he saw Wallander approaching in his blue Peugeot, he raised his hand in greeting and got in behind the wheel. Wallander followed the police car, the frozen gravel crunching under the tires. They passed the turnoff toward Trunnerup and continued up a number of steep hills until they came to Lunarp. They swung onto a narrow dirt road that was hardly more than a tractor rut. After a kilometer, they were there. 2 farms next to each other, 2 whitewashed farmhouses, and neatly tended gardens. So there were some brief descriptions there. When I read those pieces, we got an idea of the prose style, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We got some setting, and we got an introduction to the protagonists as well. So the plot in each of these stories, I find very interesting the similarities here. In both stories, the victims are elderly. In The Still Life, it's a 76-year-old woman who is shot through the heart with an arrow. In Faceless Killers, it is elderly farmer Johan Lundgren who has been bludgeoned to death, and his wife Mariah who has been left to die with a noose around her neck. So both stories, there is violence. There's not a huge description of violence, but there is definitely more in Faceless Killers. You get later on, there's a description of the blood at the crime scene. Both stories have multiple murders. So, the similarities, back to the similarities, there is the age of the victims, there's the location. In both stories, they are set in a village. And in both stories, there is a highlight on the effect of the violence on those who live in the village. In both stories, there is some long-standing hatred, there is fear. But in Faceless Killers, we broaden out from the life of the village, which remains the plot in Still Life. We broaden out to a broader plot of Sweden, where there is immigration issues and refugee issues. So let's move on and talk about the protagonists. We got a glimpse of them in those 2 portions that I read. And in Still Life, which feels like a cozy, but is definitely also a police procedural because there's a detective, not an amateur. We have Chief Inspector Armand Gamache of the Sûreté de Quebec. He is described as being in his mid-50s. He has a solid marriage and a good relationship with his children. He is described as wise, kind, principled, and ethical. The protagonist in Faceless Killers is Kurt Wallander. He is an inspector with the Stad police force. He is 42. He is described as pessimistic, divorced. He has a difficult, if not estranged, relationship with his daughter. He drinks too much and he sleeps too little. So you can see right off the top that there is very different protagonists in these books. And so in their personal lives, they are very separate. But I do find it interesting to see the similarities in their work life. What they are like as detectives, I find interesting because they both have a very strong sense of justice. And I'm going to read a portion from each book, a team meeting with the 2 of them. And so we can see how they handle being in charge of a team. So in Still Life, Beauvoir had set up a large stand with paper and magic markers. Gamache took a seat next to him in Olivier's private back room and looked out through the wall of French doors. He could see tables, their umbrellas down, and beyond them the river. Bella Bella. He agreed. The room filled with hungry and cold Sûreté officers. Gamache noticed Agent Nickel was sitting by herself and wondered why she chose her isolated position. Beauvoir reported first between bites of a ham sandwich made with thick sliced ham carved from what must have been a maple cured roast with honey mustard sauce and slabs of aged cheddar on a fresh croissant. We scoured the site and found, Beauvoir checked his notebook, smearing a bit of mustard on the page. 3 old beer bottles. Gamache raised his eyebrows. That's it? And 15 million leaves. This is the wound. Beauvoir drew a circle using a red magic marker. The officers watched without interest. Then Beauvoir raised his hand again and completed the drawing, marking in 4 lines radiating from the circle as though marking compass points. Several officers lowered their sandwiches. Now they were interested. It looked like a crude map of 3 pines. Contemplating the macabre image, Gamache wondered if the killer could possibly have done that intentionally. Would an arrow make this wound? Beauvoir asked. No one seemed to know. If an arrow had made that wound, thought Gamache, then where was it? It should be in the body. Gamache had an image from Notre Dame de Bon Secours, the church he and René Marie attended sporadically. The walls were thick with murals of saints in various stages of pain and ecstasy. One of those images floated back to him now, Saint Sebastian writhing, falling, his body full of arrows, each one pointing out of his martyred body like accusing fingers. Jane Neal's body should have had an arrow sticking out of it, and that arrow should have pointed to the person who did this. There should not have been an exit wound, but there was. Another puzzle. Let's leave this and move on. Next report. The lunch progressed, the officers sitting around listening and thinking out loud in an atmosphere that encouraged collaboration. He strongly believed in collaboration, not competition, within his team. He realized he was in a minority within the leadership of the Sûreté. He believed a good leader was also a good follower, and he invited his team to treat each other with respect, listen to ideas, support each other. Not everyone got it. This was a deeply competitive field, where a person who got results got promoted, and being second to solve a murder was useless. Gamache knew the wrong people were being rewarded within the Sûreté, so he rewarded the team players. He had a near-perfect solution rate and had never risen beyond the rank he now held and had held for 12 years. But he was a happy man. All right, so another great example of prose style, which we'll get to in a minute, but also a glimpse into how he works as a police officer and how he treats his team. Kurt Wallander in Faceless Killers also has a team meeting early on. At 10 a.m., everyone gathered in his office. Rydberg had been called in from the scene of the crime and was sitting in a chair by the window. 7 police officers in all, sitting and standing, filled the room. Wallander phoned the hospital and managed to ascertain that Mrs. Lovegren's condition was still critical. Then he told them what had happened. It was worse than you could imagine, he said. Wouldn't you say so, Rydberg? You're right, replied Rydberg. Like an American movie. It even smelt like blood. That doesn't usually happen. We have to find whoever did this, said Wallander, concluding his presentation. We can't leave maniacs like this on the loose. The policeman fell silent. Rydberg was drumming his fingertips on the arm of his chair. A woman could be heard laughing in the corridor outside. Wallander looked around the room. All of them were his colleagues. None of them was his close friend. And yet they were a team. Well, he said, what are we waiting for? Let's get started. It was 10:40 a.m. So again, another interesting example of prose style, but a short description of Wallander as a police officer and what he's like with his team. So again, there's some interesting similarities between the protagonists. They are both detectives of a similar rank. They both have a strong sense of justice. They both work with a team. Both of them, despite their high rank, get heavily involved in the investigation. And yet, they have very different characters. So I find that very interesting. So let's get into prose style, because here is where I think we see the biggest difference when we compare these two books, the Scandinavian Noir, Faceless Killers, and the Whodunnit, primarily, that is Still Life. The biggest difference between those two books, although there are other differences, is the prose style. Still Life by Louise is descriptive. You feel you're experiencing the story. Her writing is sensory. There are descriptions of food. You heard that. In the middle of a police report, you get this lush description of the food that the police officer is eating. But it's not just the descriptions of food. It is the leaves on the ground. You can almost hear them as they're described. As people are described walking through the leaves. You can smell the dry leaves and the food and the crisp wind. You feel the crisp fall air. Her writing is very sensory. She uses lots of analogies and similes and metaphors. I would almost say that it's poetic prose. Her words are as rich as the environment. So that's very interesting. There is definitely a connection between the prose style and the setting that the author has chosen to use. And that's true in both of these books. So in Still Life, the words are as rich as the environment. You get this cozy, warm, small village where people still gather for meals and you have long-standing friendships. And so it's this rich, lush environment. That doesn't take away from the fact that there is long-standing hatreds, that there is fear, that there are secrets, but that seems to fit this environment, this close, cozy environment. In Faceless Killers, Henning Mankell has a very different prose style, and it is definitely Scandinavian noir. It is terse, it is bleak. TheCrimeReview.com says this: crisp, minimal, and without anything unnecessary. It's a series of almost brutally clean lines, precisely engineered for maximum effect. And I think I read enough from both books for you to have an understanding. You could definitely see that in Faceless Killers, this minimal, crisp writing. And again, the words evoke the environment. You get this environment that is bleak and dreary and minimal and brutal. And the words evoke that environment. In Still Life, you get words that are lush and descriptive and sensory, and that definitely evokes the environment. So this was just a bit of a discussion comparing two different novels. I think there were some interesting similarities, but definite differences between these two types of mysteries. So do you have a preference? Do you prefer Scandinavian noir? Do you like that bleak, dreary landscape, that flawed protagonist, with stories that are often a critique of the social environment or politics? And if you do, what are some of your favorite Scandinavian noirs? Let me know down in the comments below. I love to discuss this stuff. Why do you like a Scandinavian noir, and what are some of your favorites? Do you prefer whodunits? Do you prefer that style of mystery that is a puzzle mystery? Do you like the clues laid out so that you can figure out who the killer is before it is revealed in the story? Do you like this style of whodunit, Louise Penny's Still Life? Do you like that character-driven type of a story that still has a strong plot, but lush descriptions, lush writing of a sensory nature where you get these great descriptions of food and setting and people? And if this is your favorite kind of mystery, why do you like that? I'd love to hear about that in the comments down below. And what are some of your favorite whodunits? Or more specifically, what are some of your favorite character-driven, descriptive whodunits? Let me know down in the comments below. I would love to discuss with you these two types of mysteries. And before I say goodbye, I need to give you the next My March Mystery Madness Mindbender. This long-running series was written by two writers sharing one pseudonym, and that pseudonym was also the name of their main character. Put your answers down in the comments down below, and I'll see you again tomorrow for another March Mystery Madness video. Bye!